A man clutching his jaw in pain might seem like an ordinary sight in wartime, but for the German prisoner of war newly arrived in an American camp, the reality that followed was anything but ordinary. He expected crude treatment, perhaps a pair of pliers in an unlit corner, or, worse, no treatment at all. Instead, he was directed to a spotless room, a padded chair, and an American military dentist who prepared sterilized instruments beneath a glowing lamp. The captive soldier, who had seen comrades lose teeth to infections in muddy trenches, now found himself staring at a shining drill, the hum of modern medicine filling his ears. It was not humiliation that awaited him here, but relief. And that was the first great shock. The contradiction was hard to process. These were enemy soldiers, men who only weeks earlier had been firing at Americans across battlefields. Yet here, behind the barbed wire, the rules seemed reversed. Instead of punishment, there was anesthesia. Instead of indifference, there was careful examination. A toothache, once a symbol of misery and neglect in German camps, became in America a reason for compassion. The soldiers who stepped into the dental clinic were often carried back to their barracks with gauze in their mouths, shaken not just by the treatment itself, but by the unsettling realization that their captors cared for their pain. This was more than medical procedure. It was psychological warfare of a subtle kind. To a prisoner schooled in the belief that Allied nations were decadent, cruel, and barbaric, the reality of being treated better than in his own homeland struck at the foundations of certainty. In Germany, dentists had been overworked, supplies scarce, clinics bombed into rubble. Here, in the country of the supposed enemy, the standards surpassed even civilian life back home. The German POWs did not yet speak of democracy or liberty, but the whir of the drill, the sharp scent of disinfectant, and the comfort of a padded chair whispered of a world very different from what they had been told. In one camp, a prisoner later wrote that he had waited hours in line, expecting little more than pull and bandage, yet the American dentist patiently checked each tooth, explained the procedure, and even polished the fillings. The man admitted in his confiscated diary that he felt a sting of shame not for being treated as a prisoner, but for realizing that his own nation had offered him less care and uniform than his enemy now gave him in captivity. Another POW, recalling his experience decades later, said that the memory of sitting in that chair, with the buzzing drill and the reassuring tap of instruments laid out in order, was more shocking to him than the sound of artillery. Even gossip carried weight here. Men joked uneasily about Yankee dentistry, but when a comrade returned to the barracks free of pain and with a cotton pad in his mouth, silence often replaced the laughter. Some muttered that it was a trick, that poison lay hidden in the fillings. Others whispered that perhaps America truly had more machines, more doctors, more humanity, and in that tension, the toothache became more than pain. It became a question of faith. And so, in these first days behind the wire, German soldiers learned a lesson they had not anticipated, that even a tooth could expose the fragility of ideology. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And let me ask you, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now in your corner of the world? For many of the German prisoners, the shock deepened when they realized that what they experienced was not an isolated act of mercy, but a system. Dentistry in American camps was not battlefield improvisation. It was organized, scheduled, and regulated like any other branch of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Every camp had its infirmary, and within that, a dental section staffed by officers trained in universities that still stood untouched by war. These dentists rotated through the camps with their kits of drills, forceps, molds, and anesthetics, bringing a standard of care that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, what the average German citizen could hope for in peacetime. This contrast was staggering. Germany, battered by years of bombing, rationing, and conscription, had seen its medical system strained to breaking. Dental care, once a matter of civic pride in German cities, had been reduced to crude extractions and waiting lists that stretched for months. The average Wehrmacht soldier could go years without seeing a dentist, unless in dire pain. By 1944, shortages of anesthesia and modern instruments forced even military clinics to rely on outdated techniques, sometimes using alcohol as the only numbing agent. For a German POW, To sit in an American chair and be offered Novocain was to step into a different world, one where pain could be banished in minutes rather than endured for weeks. It was not only the medicine, but the ritual of it all. That left such an impression. The gleaming trays of sterilized instruments, the rinsing basins filled with clear water, the dentist's calm instructions. These details struck men accustomed to chaotic wartime conditions. In one camp in Texas, prisoners noted with disbelief that the dental clinic had electric lights burning bright even at night, while in their own villages back home, blackouts forced families to huddle in darkness. The symbolism was impossible to ignore even behind barbed wire, in the land of the enemy. A soldier could experience a standard of care that German civilians under the swastika had lost. Everyday anecdotes reinforced the sense of reversal. A POW once admitted to a fellow captive that he dreaded the dentist, remembering childhood visits in Germany where he had been strapped down and drilled without anesthetic. To his astonishment, the American officer not only numbed the tooth, but offered him water to rinse between steps. Another soldier reported that the dentist had asked him if he smoked, explaining that cigarettes would slow healing after extraction. The advice was delivered casually, as though patient and doctor were equals. These little details, water in a paper cup, a word of medical caution. The sterile smell of alcohol became gossip repeated endlessly in the barracks, reshaping expectations with each telling. Suspicion, of course, lingered. Some whispered that the treatments were meant to soften them, to prepare them for propaganda. But the longer the system endured, the harder it was to dismiss. Teeth were not only pulled, cavities were filled, gums were treated, even dentures provided for those who had lost too many teeth in combat. The reality could not be denied. This was not improvisation, nor trickery. It was policy. Numbers underscored the truth. In 1945 alone, American military dentists performed over 1 million dental procedures across camps, from extractions to full reconstructions. The scale impressed the German prisoners almost as much as the precision. They knew their own country could not match such statistics during wartime. One soldier reportedly muttered after returning from treatment, "If they can waste this much care on enemies, how much more must they give to their own?" The irony gnawed at many. They had fought for a regime that promised superiority, yet found themselves receiving superior care only after surrendering. Dentistry, a mundane corner of medicine, became a mirror reflecting the vast gulf between the promises of the Reich and the reality of America's abundance. And in that reflection, the prisoners began to question silently, cautiously, what else they might have been wrong about. The first impression was often visual spotless floors that shone like glass, metal surfaces polished to a mirror sheen, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. For German prisoners of war accustomed to the filth of field stations, where mud and blood mixed under dim lamps, the cleanliness of American camp clinics was almost surreal. Some men paused at the threshold, hesitant to step inside, as though their boots might contaminate something sacred. For these soldiers, raised in a society that once prided itself on order and hygiene, the irony was bitter. By the mid-1940s, Germany's infrastructure was in ruins. Clinics were crowded, supplies scarce, and infection rates high. Many POWs remembered comrades who had died not from bullets, but from untreated abscesses or blood poisoning following dental infections. Now, behind barbed wire in a foreign land, they found themselves in rooms that looked more like laboratories than prison infirmaries. White coats, latex gloves, and sterilized drills testified to a system determined not merely to maintain health, but to eliminate risk. An anecdote from a camp in Oklahoma tells of a prisoner who sat nervously in the chair, convinced the Americans were preparing to humiliate him. Instead, the dentist carefully adjusted a bright lamp, slipped on fresh gloves, and covered his chest with a clean bib. The man, recalling the moment years later, admitted that he felt an unexpected pang of dignity, as though, for a fleeting hour, he was no longer a defeated soldier, but a patient deserving of care. Such small gestures carried weight, and gossip of them spread quickly across the barracks. Others noticed details invisible at first glance. Instruments boiled in stainless steel trays before use. Assistants wiped surfaces with alcohol between patients. Needles came sealed in packets that were opened only moments before the injection. To men who had seen comrades share unwashed tools in makeshift clinics, these rituals were revelations. One prisoner whispered that the Americans treated them like porcelain, fragile yet valuable, a remark that lingered in the minds of those who overheard. The shock was not merely aesthetic, it was psychological. Cleanliness suggested abundance. To maintain such standards required not only discipline, but resources, steady supplies of gloves, gauze, anesthetic, sterilizing agents. German POWs knew their homeland could not have maintained such stockpiles in wartime. Each fresh bandage and sterilized needle symbolized a depth of American production they could scarcely imagine. For many, it was the first intimate glimpse of the industrial machine that had overwhelmed them on the battlefield. Not all accepted it with grace. Some muttered darkly that such care was an insult, a mockery of their suffering back home. They save our teeth while our families hide from bombs. One man scrawled in a confiscated notebook. Yet even this bitterness was tinged with envy. The sheer disparity gnawed at them if the enemy could afford such luxuries for prisoners. What must life be like for civilians beyond the wire? The barracks buzzed with speculation. Was it propaganda a trap? Or was this simply how America functioned? Prisoners debated late into the night, voices rising and falling as men argued whether to trust what they saw with their own eyes. Some clung stubbornly to suspicion. Others began to admit quietly, cautiously, that the enemy's system seemed stronger, cleaner, more humane. The clinic's gleaming tiles and sterilized drills became symbols of a larger truth that no amount of Nazi indoctrination could erase. And when silence fell at the end of these debates, many prisoners lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by memories of the front, but by the shining image of an American dentist's lamp, a light far brighter than any they had seen in their ruined cities. If the shock of cleanliness unsettled the German POWs, it was the everyday encounters, small, almost trivial moments that slowly began to pierce their defenses. Pain eased without cruelty. Casual words spoken by a dentist, or a simple gesture of comfort could linger in memory far longer than drills or syringes. These were not dramatic rescues, nor elaborate surgeries, but ordinary acts that carried extraordinary weight. One prisoner recalled how, when his tooth was extracted, the dentist paused to ask if he felt pain before proceeding. The man had never been asked such a question in his life. In the Wehrmacht, pain was expected, endurance glorified. To admit suffering was weakness. Here, the enemy soldier treated him as though his comfort mattered. He wrote later that the question, "Does this hurt?" stunned him more than the force of the pliers. Others remembered the smallest details: a paper cup of water handed to rinse, the offer of extra gauze to take back to the barracks, a reminder not to smoke after a filling. These tokens seemed insignificant to the Americans who gave them, but to men raised in a war-ravaged system, they were almost luxuries. In a Missouri camp, one POW reportedly smuggled his used paper cup back to the barracks, showing it off like a relic. Marveling at the fact that even disposable items were available in such abundance, gossip carried these details farther than any official report. A soldier returned to his barrack boasting that the dentist had used Novocain not once, but twice to ensure he felt no pain. Another whispered about being given aspirin for the headache afterward, something he had not seen in months. Soon, stories circulated of men being fitted for dentures, of polished fillings gleaming in their mouths. Some joked that America was rebuilding their teeth so they could bite into hamburgers when the war ended. Others, more quietly, admitted that such treatment made them question everything they had been told about their captors. The encounters also revealed cultural contrasts. German soldiers, trained to obey in silence, were astonished when American dentists gave explanations during treatment. "This will pinch. You may feel pressure. It will be over soon." Such words humanized the experience, transforming a terrifying procedure into something almost routine. A POW later confessed that the simple act of being spoken to as an equal patient was more disarming than any lecture on democracy. There were moments of tension, too. In one camp, a German officer initially refused anesthesia, declaring it unnecessary. The dentist insisted, injecting Novocain anyway, leaving the officer too numb to protest further. When he returned to the barracks, the man's silence spoke louder than words. Pride had collapsed under the pressure of unexpected mercy, and sometimes the memories became almost humorous. A prisoner with a mouthful of gauze tried to explain to his comrades what had happened, only to be met with laughter at his muffled speech. The laughter, however, carried no malice. It was the relief of men realizing that, for once, the enemy had caused no suffering. These small encounters accumulated, shaping a larger truth. The POWs began to see that dentistry in America was not about propaganda or spectacle. It was about routine, the ordinary routine of a nation wealthy enough, confident enough, to extend care even to its enemies. Each paper cup, each dose of anesthetic, each word of reassurance became a quiet assault on the prisoners' beliefs. The Reich had taught them that enemies were cruel and merciless. The dental chair suggested otherwise. And so, behind the wire, the greatest battles were fought not with bullets or bombs, but with drills, syringes, and gauze, each encounter pulling another thread loose in the fabric of certainty. At first, gratitude came grudgingly. The German prisoners, steeped in suspicion, were reluctant to admit they felt anything other than unease at the enemy's kindness. But the more procedures they endured, the more undeniable the truth became. The Americans were not merely performing propaganda stunts. They were genuinely treating their pain. In a camp in Arkansas, one young soldier confessed in his diary that he had expected his tooth extraction to be a punishment in disguise. Instead, he left the chair stunned by the efficiency and lack of pain. That night, he whispered to his bunkmate that the experience had shaken him more than interrogation. "If they can show mercy here," he muttered, "then what else have we misunderstood?" Such whispers, repeated in the darkness, spread further than any lecture could. The reluctance to trust made the gratitude feel heavier when it finally surfaced. Men who had mocked the American softness began to admit that perhaps such softness was strength. They compared notes: how many times the dentist rinsed the tools, how many minutes the anesthetic took to numb the jaw, how carefully the sutures were tied. These conversations, once filled with suspicion, shifted gradually into praise, though couched in irony. "The Yankees are trying to win us over with fillings." One prisoner laughed, but no one contradicted him when he added, "Better fillings than neglect." Everyday gossip crystallized into reluctant admiration. In one camp, prisoners debated which dentist was more skilled, ranking them like football teams back home. Another group marveled that replacements for broken dentures could be requested, a thought that bordered on absurd to men who had lived through years of shortages. The contrast between what they endured in Germany and what they received in captivity grew too stark to ignore. This reluctant gratitude reshaped dynamics in the barracks. Bitter men who clung to ideology found themselves silenced by those whose toothaches had been cured. Even officers who resisted American tricks had to confront the loyalty eroding among their men. Pain, after all, is universal, and the hand that relieves it often wins more trust than the one that commands. Here lies a question not just for history, but for you, the viewer. If you were a prisoner, taught that your captors were inhuman, and then found relief in their hands, would you cling to suspicion or allow gratitude to change you? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Statistics underline how widespread this transformation was. By 1945, thousands of POWs in the United States had received fillings, extractions, and even reconstructive work. Reports show survival rates for dental infections in U.S. camps far exceeded those in German field hospitals. Numbers, cold and precise, gave weight to what gossip in the barracks already confirmed America's system worked. And with each procedure, gratitude seeped further into the prisoners' hearts. They may not have admitted it openly, but when they rinsed their mouths with clean water and left the chair free of pain, they carried back more than relief. They carried back a fragment of doubt about their own nation's promises, and about the enemy they had been taught to despise. By the time months had passed, gossip in the barracks had grown into a culture of its own. Dental visits, once dreaded, became stories retold with the embellishment of campfire legends. Men who had never before spoken much began describing, in surprising detail, the strange rituals of American dentistry: the humming drill, the white gloves, the smell of disinfectant. These stories spread through the camp with a force stronger than propaganda pamphlets. One group of prisoners in a camp in Kansas joked that the real escape tunnel was through the dentist's chair, not into freedom, but into a strange new understanding of the enemy. Another soldier, half serious, claimed that the Americans had rebuilt his molars better than German surgeons ever had. His remark drew laughter, but no denial, for in truth, everyone recognized the extraordinary nature of what was happening. The enemy was not merely caring for them, but surpassing the medical standards of their own homeland. Diaries, when later confiscated, revealed the same theme. A soldier described with amazement that he had been given a small mirror to see his treated teeth, as if the dentist wanted him to share responsibility for the outcome. Another recorded that he was offered a choice between extraction and filling, a choice that in wartime Germany would never have been available to a common soldier. Such details, seemingly mundane, became points of pride among the men, retold like trophies in the barracks. Arguments also broke out. Some prisoners insisted this generosity was a trick, a subtle form of re-education. Others countered with blunt realism if it was propaganda, then at least it healed their pain. These debates often lasted deep into the night, voices rising and falling, until silence returned with the creak of bunks and the shuffle of restless bodies. Yet even silence was a kind of victory for the Americans, for it meant the prisoners were thinking. An officer in one camp tried to forbid his men from discussing their treatments, calling it enemy manipulation, but the effort backfired. Soldiers whispered more eagerly, eager to share every detail that undermined their officer's warning. Stories multiplied of extra gauze tucked into a pocket, of a dentist cracking a joke mid-procedure, of dentures so precise they fit better than the originals. The barracks became an echo chamber where doubt spread more effectively than any lecture could. Here is where I want to turn to you. The audience. Imagine yourself sitting in a cold wooden barrack, hearing your comrades argue some swearing it's propaganda, others insisting it's genuine kindness. Which side would you believe? Share your answer in the comments below. I'd like to know how you think you would react. Over time, the gossip even spilled into humor. Men teased each other about their Yankee smiles, claiming that they would return to Germany with teeth straighter and brighter than they had ever known. Beneath the jokes, though, ran a current of unease. If America could afford such luxuries for prisoners, what else did this country have in reserve? How deep was its strength? The barracks thus became more than places of confinement. They became theaters of quiet transformation, where every retold dental story chipped away at the edifice of Nazi certainty, and as laughter mingled with suspicion, as envy softened into reluctant respect. The gossip itself became a force of re-education more persuasive than any pamphlet or speech, because it came from the mouths of fellow soldiers who had felt the drill, smelled the disinfectant, and left the chair free of pain. Years later, when the war had ended and the prisoners returned home, many carried with them not only the scars of battle, but also the memories of a dentist's chair in an American camp. These recollections, seemingly trivial in the sweep of global conflict, lingered with surprising clarity. A tooth saved, an infection cured, a set of dentures fitted. Such details took on symbolic weight for the men who had grown up in a Germany that glorified hardness and sacrifice. These moments of care remained etched in memory like faint inscriptions on stone. Some former POWs admitted decades later that their first doubts about Nazi propaganda were born not in classrooms or political debates, but under the bright light of a dental lamp. One man recalled that, after a cavity was filled with precision and gentleness, he left the chair convinced for the first time that perhaps his captors were not monsters. Another remembered how a dentist had joked about the difficulty of pulling a stubborn tooth, treating the prisoner not as an enemy, but as a patient with a shared human problem. These gestures, minor in the moment, became major in memory. What struck them most was not just the treatment itself, but the contrast in Germany. Civilians lined up for hours in overcrowded clinics, hoping for anesthesia that often ran out. Soldiers at the front endured infections until the pain forced crude extractions. But in the American camps, dentistry was systematic, routine, and almost taken for granted for many POWs. This became the most haunting lesson of all, that the enemy they had despised was capable of building a society where even the most ordinary medical service surpassed what their homeland could provide during war. The gossip of the barracks transformed into stories told to families. Some spoke with pride about the fillings they had received, as though these were war medals. Others admitted sheepishly that they owed their surviving teeth to the kindness of their captors, for a generation raised on ideology and steel. These memories became strange emblems of vulnerability, proof that power could also take the form of care. Not all were comfortable with these recollections. Some veterans refused to speak of their dental experiences, fearing that acknowledgement of kindness would sound like betrayal. Yet silence itself testified to the weight of memory. For every story told, there were others locked away, hidden like unhealed wounds. And so, dentistry, a subject rarely mentioned in histories of war, became an unlikely bridge. It connected defeated soldiers to the humanity of their captors, planted seeds of doubt that later blossomed into acceptance of a different world. In a way, the drill and the forceps were tools not only of medicine, but of transformation. The lesson remained long after the barbed wire was gone, that sometimes history turns not on battles or treaties, but on quiet moments when an enemy lays aside enmity to treat another's pain. And in those moments, the sharpest incision is not made by steel, but by compassion. Long after the barracks were dismantled and the watchtowers taken down, memories of the American camps lived on in the minds of those who had passed through them. For many German prisoners, it was not the clang of gates or the endless roll calls that returned in their dreams, but the unlikely image of a dentist's lamp glowing above their heads. They remembered the faint hum of the drill, the scent of disinfectant, the strange comfort of a padded chair. These details, so small in the scale of war, became symbols of a contradiction too powerful to forget that mercy had come from the hands of an enemy. The rhythm of history often celebrates grand strategies and decisive battles. Yet here, it was shaped in moments of intimacy, the rinsing of a mouth, the gentle touch of gauze pressed against the bleeding gum. For men raised in a world that preached hardness and sacrifice, these encounters revealed another kind of strength, the ability of a nation to extend compassion even to those who had fought against it. A tooth saved, a pain eased, a smile restored. These were not mere medical acts, but fragments of a larger truth about abundance, confidence, and humanity. Some former POWs would later tell their children not about artillery or campaigns, but about the American dentist who treated them as though they were human beings first and prisoners second. Others remained silent. But in that silence lay the weight of memories too unsettling to share. The echo of kindness endured, like a note struck once and left to resonate across a lifetime. And so we are left with a lesson that history is not only written in the clash of armies, but in the quiet, unrecorded gestures that alter hearts. Sometimes the sharpest weapon is not steel, but compassion, a force that lingers longer than victory or defeat.